This video is brought to you by Brilliant. For most of the past 20 years or so, China has been buying dollars on the international currency market with its own currency to keep the yuan devalued and nurture China's booming manufacturing and export sectors. As a consequence of this, China has accumulated trillions of dollars, which it mainly uses to buy dollar-denominated debt and US treasuries. This has always been a point of anxiety for US policymakers, but this anxiety has become particularly acute recently because new research suggests that China has actually been hiding its dollar reserves, which are roughly twice as big as the official figures from the People's Bank of China. So in this video, we're going to have a look at why China loves dollars, how it hides them, and why this poses a systemic risk to the global economy. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. So this story probably really starts in the late 90s or early 2000s, when China went from a net importer to a net exporter. Previously, China had actually had an overvalued currency. Like many other developing countries in the 80s and 90s, it had pegged its currency, the yuan, to the dollar at a higher rate than it should have been to make sure that China was able to afford its imports. However, sometime in the 90s, the CCP realised that there was actually an economic benefit to having an undervalued currency, because it made China's exports more competitive and advantaged China's manufacturing sector. This is one of the reasons why China dramatically devalued its currency in the 90s, from 1.6 yuan per dollar in 1980 to 5.8 yuan per dollar in 1993, and then 8.3 yuan per dollar in 1995. Because the yuan was undervalued, China started running bigger and bigger trade surpluses. Essentially, because the yuan was cheap, Chinese consumers couldn't buy very much stuff from abroad, and Chinese manufacturers could produce stuff really cheaply, undercutting foreign manufacturers and creating massive demand for Chinese exports. This meant that China started exporting more stuff than it imported, hence a trade surplus. Now, according to standard economic theory, trade flows should balance out over time. This is because if a country like China is running a trade surplus, this should mean there's lots of demand for the yuan, because that's what other countries need to buy Chinese goods. This should, in turn, push up the value of the yuan, making Chinese exports more expensive and increasing China's purchasing power and, therefore, imports, which should eventually neutralize the trade surplus. However, China didn't want this, and they instead wanted to keep nurturing China's manufacturing and export industries, so they deliberately devalued their currency against the dollar by using billions of yuan to buy dollars on the international market. This process really accelerated in the early 2000s, and as a result, China started accumulating tons of dollars, which are known as its dollar reserves. From 2002 to 2012, China's central bank was active in the currency market almost every day, keeping down the value of the yuan to preserve China's economic model. Maintaining China's devalued currency was a feat in itself. To buy this many dollars, the People's Bank of China had to print lots of yuan, which would usually risk domestic inflation. But the PBOC essentially coerced Chinese banks into limiting their loans to keep inflation down. China then uses these dollars to buy US-denominated financial assets, including, most notably, US treasuries. In practice, this means that the US government borrows a lot of money from China. This became a point of anxiety in the Obama administration, and former Treasury Secretary Lawrence Summers said that the US and China had become trapped in what he termed a balance of financial terror. Essentially, China relied on the US for demand for China's exports, and the US depended on China recycling those dollars into treasuries for financing. The Obama administration was worried that, if China and the US fell out, China could dump all its treasuries to spike US interest rates or sell off its dollars to devalue the dollar. While this would eventually cripple the Chinese economy, which relies on US demand to absorb its exports, it would first cause economic chaos in the US, which is what Obama was worried about. The balance of power shifted in America's favour after the 2008 financial crisis, mainly because the US realised that it didn't need China to finance its deficits, as it could essentially just print dollars and use those to buy treasuries. And this didn't seem to cause much domestic inflation. However, more recently, American policymakers have once again become anxious about the US's economic interdependence with China, and this time it's because China has apparently started hiding its reserves. Analysts first started getting suspicious in the 2010s, in part because the People's Bank of China's official reserves suddenly plateaued. But new research by Brad Setzer at the China Project suggests that the true scale of China's reserves is far bigger than anyone imagined. According to Setzer, China had stashed away another $3 trillion in semi-official banks and agencies, including, perhaps most notably, the China Development Bank, or CDB, and the Export-Import Bank of China, otherwise known as Exim. While these aren't the same as the central bank, so they don't show up on China's official reserve sheet, they're de facto controlled by the Chinese government. This is a huge number. For context, $3 trillion is larger than the entire reserves of Japan, the world's second largest reserve holder according to IMF data, and nearly 4 times larger than Switzerland. So why does any of this matter? Well, because such an enormous stack of dollars runs the risk of what some analysts have described as a dollar avalanche, which would be essentially difficult to detect given how China's dollar reserves are hidden. Essentially, Chinese banks are holding too many dollars, more than they really need, because they've been told to by the Chinese state. This is fine at the moment because the dollar is riding high, but if the dollar starts to decline, say if the Fed starts lowering interest rates, or the Chinese economy roars back to life, sparking a demand for yuan over the dollar, then these banks might decide to start getting rid of their dollars. Usually, this would be fine, but because Chinese banks have so many dollars, this poses a systemic risk to the global economy. If Chinese banks dumped billions or even trillions of dollars simultaneously, they could create a dangerous feedback loop, whereby their dollar dumping pushes down the value of the dollar, encouraging further dumping, pushing the dollar down further. This would create a rapid depreciation of the dollar, with unpredictable consequences for America and the global economy. Essentially, the point we're making is that China's enormous dollar reserves poses a systemic risk to the world economy, especially given quite how opaque the Chinese banking system has become. It's interesting that even as people ostensibly into politics, the TLDR team spends more and more time analysing data and economic information as it becomes more and more critical. As a bunch of people who are ordinarily more focused on words than numbers, we've really benefited from courses on Brilliant.org in order to keep ourselves sharp. That's because Brilliant is the best way to learn maths and computer science in a fun and interactive way. From foundational and advanced maths to AI, data science, neural networks, decision making, and more, with new lessons added monthly. Even if you, like us, don't necessarily think of yourself as a traditional STEM kind of person, these courses could prove incredibly useful for your life and career. Courses like data analysis and the fundamentals of statistics can help anyone ensure that they're properly understanding our increasingly data-driven world, which is good news if your boss suddenly asks you to analyse a trade war, an economy, or the collapse of a currency. You know, just hypothetically. Anyway, you can try everything Brilliant has to offer free for a full 30 days by clicking on the link in the description. Plus, the first 200 of you will get 20% off Brilliant's annual premium subscription. Thanks for your support and for watching TLDR.